Welcome to EchoShade, where history whispers its darkest secrets and forgotten stories.
They were not born with banners, crowns, or royal bloodlines, yet they shaped the destiny of nations. They commanded fleets larger than navies, negotiated with kings like equals, and carved their own kingdoms out of open waters. History remembers them as criminals, but empires knew them as rivals. The world's greatest pirate rulers did something no emperor expected. They built empires without land. Their thrones floated, their armies sailed, and their power was measured not in palaces or provinces, but in the number of cannons that roared at their command. The first storms began in the waters of the South China Sea, where a young woman with no noble birth, no inheritance, and no family name worth remembering rose from nothing, defied tradition, broke every boundary for her gender and time, and carved her authority into the bones of two great empires. She did not command respect, she forced it. Her name would never appear in the genealogies of kings, yet she became more feared than any Chinese admiral or European commander of her age. Her rise began in silence. Sold into a floating brothel as a girl, drifting from port to port, she learned early the corruptions of powerful men, their weaknesses, their lies, their desires, their vanities. She listened, she studied, she waited, and every night she watched storm clouds gather over the sea, wondering how many men believed themselves untouchable simply because they carried a sword or command a seal. One day, a notorious pirate lord boarded her brothel. He did not come for flesh. He came for fate. Zheng Yi, master of the Red Flag Fleet, saw something in her eyes, calculation, ambition, and a cold fire that no poverty could extinguish. He married her, thinking he had claimed a possession. Instead, he had aligned himself with a force far greater than he understood. When Zheng Yi died suddenly during a storm, the entire pirate confederation assumed his widow would either vanish into obscurity or be claimed as a prize by another captain. They were wrong. She stepped onto the deck of the flagship, faced thousands of hardened men, and issued a decree that no queen, no empress, no noblewoman of China had ever dared to speak. "You will answer to me now." The sea fell silent, not because she shouted, but because she didn't. Her voice was calm, controlled, impossibly steady. She offered no promises, no seductive manipulation of loyalty. She offered something far more dangerous: order. For years, the South China Sea had been a place of chaos. Rival fleets, disloyal alliances, captains killing captains for glory. But she saw potential. She saw an empire waiting for one iron will to claim it. Within months, every pirate flotilla from Vietnam to Guangdong accepted her rule, willingly or by force. The world would one day whisper her name as Ching Shih, the Pirate Queen. But at that moment, she was simply a woman who understood that domination was not a matter of strength, but structure. She reorganized the entire pirate world with a clarity that shocked even her closest allies. No stealing from villages that paid tribute. No harming women. No disobeying orders. No dividing spoils unfairly, no retreating without direct approval. Breaking these laws meant execution. Some crimes meant a fate worse than execution. Empires called her a monster. Her fleets called her a savior. Her navy grew to 70,000 men, dwarfing the official Qing Navy. She controlled trade routes, taxed merchants, negotiated with Western companies, and seized coastal towns with the efficiency of a professional kingdom. European diplomats wrote in secret that she had become the unofficial empress of the southern seas. But she was not the only pirate who learned to rule beyond the reach of kings. Far across the oceans, another terror was rising, one who reshaped the Caribbean the way Qing Shih reshaped Asia. His name was spoken with disgust by governors and envy by soldiers who felt trapped in rigid hierarchies. He was called Black Caesar. Before the transatlantic nightmare enslaved millions, Caesar had been a warrior chieftain who refused to bow to European chains. Captured, shipped across the Atlantic, and destined for a plantation, he instead orchestrated one of the greatest escapes in maritime history. When a hurricane struck, chaos erupted on board the slave ship. Caesar did not run. He took control. He freed others, seized weapons, and together they overtook the ship. He turned that stolen vessel into a new kind of nation, a floating sanctuary for runaway slaves, deserters, rebels, fugitives, anyone crushed under European empires. His island bases were hidden from maps. His influence stretched across Florida and the Bahamas. His alliances forced colonial governors to issue military orders solely dedicated to eliminating him. He led not by fear, but by liberation. To his people, he was not a pirate, he was a king. He was a king. To European powers, he was an infectious idea. Freedom. But as Caesar built a refuge, another pirate was shaping something much more sinister. Bartholomew Roberts, known as Blackbeard, became the most successful Atlantic pirate of all time, capturing hundreds of ships with the arrogance of a man who believed kingdoms were beneath him. His flair was theatrical. Red velvet coat, diamond cross, pistols strapped like jewelry. But beneath the flamboyance was a strategist rivaling the greatest generals. Roberts crafted a pirate code so strict it bordered on military law. No drinking during missions. No gambling with money. Lights out at 8. Musicians must practice on Sundays. Anyone harming women would be executed. His ships were not pirate dens, they were floating republics. He ruled the Atlantic not as a tyrant, but as a strange, democratic sovereign. Votes were cast. Loot was divided equally. Captains were removed if unfit. Barbados, Brazil, Ireland, West Africa. Roberts conquered them all with terrifying ease. European cities feared him more than foreign navies. And then, there were the Ottomans. In the Mediterranean, where East met West and empires collided like waves, one man rose from enslavement to command a fleet that rivaled entire nations. His name was Kamar al-Din, but Europe, with trembling breath, called him Barbarossa. He did not just attack ships, he negotiated with sultans. He did not just raid coasts, he bent them to his rule. He did not just capture cities, he governed them. And with his brother Oris, he turned Algeria into a fortress, state independent of Spain. When Oris fell, Kamar al-Din continued alone, shaking the balance of power between the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg. Barbarossa commanded hundreds of ships, reshaped Mediterranean warfare, and forced European kings to treat him like a sovereign ruler, even though every one of his victories began as piracy. At the same time, in the Indian Ocean, a man named Kanhoji Anga rose from humble origins to become a maritime emperor whose power the British, Dutch, and Portuguese all failed to break. Anga controlled both sides of the Arabian Sea, taxed company ships, and built coastal strongholds that repelled Western navies repeatedly. He was called a pirate only because the Europeans refused to admit what he really was, an indigenous naval king. From the shores of Bengal to the coasts of East Africa, from the Mediterranean to the Caribbean, one truth united all these rulers. They were not servants of kings. They were the sea's true monarchs. Their power did not come from bloodlines. It came from audacity, from strategy. From the willingness to go where empires hesitated. Each one carved an empire from waters no nation could fully control. And each one, in their final years, forced the very empires they defied to negotiate, submit, or retreat. But the greatest secret in their story is not how they lived, it's how they survived. Empires crushed rebels, executed dissidents, hanged criminals, and erased threats. Yet these pirates who defied kings and toppled naval powers endured long enough to see treaties written in their honor, cities renamed under their command, and entire regions acknowledge their authority. It was not immortality, it was something greater, unconquerable influence. And as the waves carried their legacies forward, new pirates rose on the edges of the map, inheriting oceans soaked with ambition and blood. Their stories intertwined, their empires collided, and everywhere they went, kings trembled at the idea that one ship, one captain, one outlaw could rewrite the fate of nations. This was the age when pirates did not fear empires. Empires feared pirates. The oceans had always belonged to nature, but for a brief, violent window in history, they belonged to outlaws who ruled without permission. Every coastline whispered their names. Every monarch kept secret reports detailing their movements. Every admiral sailed with dread, knowing that a single pirate flagship could turn royal fleets into floating wreckage. But the true terror of these pirates was not their cannons, it was their ideas. The idea that a man or a woman could rise from slavery, poverty, exile, or obscurity and command thousands, simply by force of will. The idea that the rules of nations were meaningless on open waters. The idea that power did not need a crown, only courage. In the years after the rise of Qing Shih, the oceans became a theater of shadow wars, where pirate rulers collided with empires like storms crashing against ancient fortresses. And the first tremor after her domination came from a man who had once been broken, chained, and starved under Spanish rule, yet became one of the most feared naval commanders the New World had ever seen. His name was Henry Morgan. Long before Hollywood romanticized pirates with parrots and rum, Morgan carved his legacy into the Caribbean in a way no chronicler could soften. He was not simply a thief. He was a weapon, unleashed by the English crown as a privateer. A polite term for a government-approved pirate. Morgan realized something revolutionary. Empires could be ruled not by kings, but by men willing to do what kings could not openly sanction. He plundered Spanish towns, burned coastal cities, and destabilized entire regions, not for greed, but for strategy. His attacks were not chaotic raids, they were military campaigns, planned with precision. Morgan revoked the unwritten code of pirates and replaced it with a new vision. A pirate who governed like a general, not a rogue. When he led his famous assault on Panama, he marched across mountains, split Spanish defenses, and conquered a city thought to be impregnable. He looted vast treasures, yes. But more importantly, he demonstrated something terrifying to European courts. A pirate could defeat a colonial empire. And England rewarded him not with a rope, but with a title. Sir Henry Morgan, Knighted Buccaneer, Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. The pirate who once slept under broken sails now ruled from a governor's mansion, sipping wine under portraits of kings. But behind Morgan's rise, another power in the Caribbean was growing, not supported by any crown, not backed by any nation, but forged from the fire of oppression. The Maroon Pirates of Jamaica, descendants of enslaved Africans who escaped plantation cruelty, built hidden mountain kingdoms, touched by European armies. Their greatest leader, Queen Mani, combined guerrilla warfare with maritime control, turning Jamaica's coast into a death trap for English ships. She commanded respect with a quiet authority that came from endurance rather than brutality. To Europeans, these maroon fighters were rebels. To pirates, they were the purest form of freedom. Their coastal raids, swift and silent, kept colonial governors awake at night. They did not attack for wealth, they attacked to protect sovereignty, a word Europe believed only kings could claim. Yet these communities, formed by fugitives, existed as independent nations on islands claimed by empires. And as the Caribbean trembled between Morgan's calculated terror and the Maroons' tactical resistance, the Mediterranean erupted once again in flames. For the death of one sea ruler always paved the way for another. After the era of the first Barbarossa ended, the Ottoman seas saw the rise of a new maritime overlord, Turgut Rise, known to Europeans as Dragut, A former slave, rower and captive of the Knights of Malta, Dragut escaped chains, reclaimed his power, and returned with a fury shaped by humiliation. He was brilliant, quiet, relentless, a man who fought not for gold, but for vengeance and legacy. His raids were mathematical, his strategies nearly prophetic. He predicted winds, currents, political shifts, and human behavior with airy accuracy. Towns did not fear his arrival. They feared his silence before arrival, for it meant he had already predicted how to take them. Venice hated him. Spain feared him. Even Suleiman the Magnificent respected him. And pirates across the Mediterranean learned from him how to fight like an empire without becoming one, how to rule by influence rather than territory. Dragut turned Libya's shores into a fortress, commanded fleets that challenged Christian coalitions, and proved that the Mediterranean was not a European lake. It was a battlefield controlled by men Europe refused to acknowledge as equals. While Dragut dominated the east, a new storm brewed in the west, across the Atlantic and deep into the Indian Ocean. The Mughal Empire, known for palaces of marble and queens adorned with diamonds, faced a rival no emperor expected, the Sindhi and Balok pirates of the Arabian Sea, whose swift, narrow ships outmaneuvered massive imperial vessels. These seaborne warriors belonged to no kingdom, yet they controlled ports from Oman to Gujarat and taxed Mughal trade routes long before European powers arrived. Empires tried diplomacy. They tried force. They tried alliances. Nothing worked. These pirate clans operated with tribal loyalty older than Mughal authority. Their fleets were built not for intimidation but survival, crafted to glide over shallow waters where larger ships could not follow. Their captains were elected through merit, not birth. Their strategies were shaped by generations of hardship along rugged coasts. To Europeans, they were pirates. To their people, they were protectors. To the oceans, they were shadows. Meanwhile, far to the north, in the frigid Baltic waters, another pirate king ruled silently. Claes Störtebeker, the legendary leader of the Victual Brothers. He challenged the Hanseatic League, one of the richest mercantile powers of medieval Europe. His ships targeted wealthy trade routes, and his followers carved out a floating state that threatened some of Europe's most powerful cities. His legend became so terrifying that even his execution added to his myth. When he was beheaded, his body supposedly walked several steps before collapsing, a story so deeply embedded in folklore that even centuries later, some Germans whispered that Störtebeker's spirit still protected the poor against the greed of the rich. Every region, every age, every ocean, pirates rose not as chaotic criminals, but as forces born from injustice, ambition, brilliance, and desperation. They were reflections of the world around them, the world kings tried to hide behind marble walls and velvet curtains. Yet no empire could hide from the next pirate emperor who emerged. In the Indian Ocean, after the death of Portuguese strongmen and the retreat of Arab traders, new powers battled over spice routes worth more than gold. In this crucible, a new pirate commander rose, Kempel Arayan, the Admiral of Travancore, a man the British East India Company learned to fear. Though technically a naval officer, he operated on the edge of legality, striking British ships with guerrilla tactics that traditional navies could not counter. To the British, he was a pirate. To his homeland, he was a guardian. Through him, through anger, through the city pirates of Janjira, the message became clear. Europe never truly controlled the Indian Ocean. Indigenous pirate empires did. These were not isolated incidents. They were the pulse of a global phenomenon. Pirates ruled because empires exploited, because justice was scarce, because opportunity at sea was greater than life on land. They created alternative worlds, floating democracies, floating kingdoms, floating sanctuaries, floating tyrannies, floating nations, and through these worlds, emerged one universal truth. Empires were not the only architects of history. Pirates were co-authors. By the time the 18th century reached its midpoint, European monarchs realized something horrifying. Pirates were no longer nuisances. They were geopolitical powers. They disrupted trade revenue, destabilized colonial systems, and united oppressed groups across continents. And as kings prepared their final campaigns to crush these maritime uprisings, the pirates prepared something even more dangerous: unity. For the first time, pirate rulers across oceans, from the Caribbean to China, from the Mediterranean to East Africa, shared a common enemy: empire. This was no longer about treasure, no longer about rebellion, no longer about survival. This was about sovereignty, the right to rule themselves on waters no nation truly owned. And as the waves carried the footsteps of the next great uprising, the world began to transition toward the final, most explosive era of pirate dominance. An era where monarchs launched extermination campaigns, where pirates built alliances, where secret ports flourished, and where the greatest maritime battles in history erupted between outlaws and nations. The oceans darkened, the guns were prepared, and the final showdown between pirate empires and land empires was about to begin. The oceans were changing. Empires sensed it before they admitted it. The world's balance of power had begun shifting from gilded thrones to damp wooden decks, from imperial seals to pirate flags, from royal admirals to outlaws who ruled the tides with a freedom that felt almost mythical, tactical. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the oceans were no longer passive trade routes. They had become contested kingdoms, and the kings and queens of these water kingdoms did not follow the codes of nations. They followed the codes they carved in salt, blood, and purpose. Empires saw their colonies bleed wealth. Merchants saw their ships vanish. Governors heard whispers that pirates had begun forming alliances no one expected. And as the world trembled on the edge of this shifting era, one place became the center of a storm that would reshape maritime history forever: Madagascar. For years it had been ignored, dismissed as a wild land of strange beasts and forgotten tribes. But to pirates, it was paradise, a land free from kings, free from laws, protected by treacherous reefs, and blessed with hidden harbors no official navy could enter safely. It became more than a hideout. It became a capital. The legend spread through taverns in London, markets in Cairo, ports in Calicut, and brothels in Havana. There existed a pirate nation known as Libertalia, a utopia built by outlaws, escaped slaves, former soldiers, and anyone who wished to live outside the reach of monarchs. Whether Libertalia truly existed in the pure form later myths described is still debated. But one truth is certain: Madagascar was ruled by pirates, and at their center was a man as mysterious as the island itself, Captain James Misson. Misson was different. Not brutal like Blackbeard, not strategic like Roberts, not imperial like Barbarossa. He was ideological, almost revolutionary. He believed pirates could build a society where race, faith, and class held no power, where loot was equal, where people voted, where justice was not bought, where the sea and the island belonged to those strong enough to defend it. His growing base on Madagascar terrified European powers more than any individual pirate ever had, because it proved a nightmare possibility. What if pirates stopped wandering and actually built a country? If that happened, the entire colonial world could collapse. But even as Madagascar grew into a pirate republic, another region was becoming a crucible of chaos: the West African coast, where pirate powers and African kingdoms collided in a volatile swirl of alliances and betrayal. Here, pirate rulers became intertwined with local monarchs, exchanging weapons for shelter, gold for loyalty, and manpower for access to the slave trade, a gruesome but dominant economy of the era. Some African rulers partnered with pirates not because they approved, but because they recognized the opportunity to turn European greed against itself. Pirates supplied cannons, rifles, and crews. In exchange, African kings offered ports, safe havens, and fighters skilled in coastal warfare. Together, they destabilized Portuguese and Dutch strongholds along the Gulf of Guinea, creating a shared sovereignty between sea warlords and land monarchs. Among these alliances, one name echoed louder than all others: the pirate king of Bangla, known only through fragments of letters and terrified colonial diaries. He was a war captain from a Central African kingdom captured by Portuguese slavers, shackled aboard a ship and destined for Brazil. But he rebelled, killed the crew, freed the captives, and returned to Africa not as a victim, but as a ruler. He commanded a fleet made from stolen ships, armed tribes with foreign weapons, and orchestrated devastating raids on European fortresses. Portuguese governors called him a shadow on the sea, claiming he appeared from nowhere and vanished into deeper nowhere. He controlled stretches of coastline like a monarch without a palace. And he proved again the most fundamental pirate truth of this era: anyone could rise, anyone could rule, and no empire could stop a man who no longer feared them. Meanwhile, across oceans, Europe faced its own crisis: the pirates of the English Channel. The Channel, narrow yet powerful, had always been under English dominance. But with the rise of Jacobite rebellions and political division in Britain, a unique breed of pirate emerged: renegade sailors who despised the crown's taxes and laws. These Channel pirates were not exotic figures like those in the Indian Ocean or the Caribbean. They were familiar, local, disguised among the very people they robbed. They formed brotherhoods, not fleets. They smuggled Jacobite agents, robbed English customs ships, and protected entire coastal villages who supported them in exchange for contraband and immunity. These pirates undermined the English crown not through battles, but through quiet disobedience, a subtle rebellion that threatened the monarchy's revenue more effectively than any cannon fire. But the greatest convergence of pirate power still belonged to the east: the South China Sea, Indian Ocean, and Arabian Sea. For even after the rise of Qing Shih, these waters continued to produce warlords who ruled with independence and skill unmatched by European navies. Off the coast of Oman, the Jawazmi pirates dismantled Portuguese and British control with strategic brilliance. Their ships were sleek, fast, lightweight. Every European vessel they captured became a trophy. They attacked company ships, seized cannon stores, and established their own influence from Muscat to Ras Al Khaimah. British officers wrote in confidential letters that the Arabian Sea was no longer the dominion of His Majesty, but the playground of the Jawazmi tribes. Their influence grew so threatening that entire diplomatic missions were organized for the sole purpose of destroying them. Yet even these missions often failed, proving that pirates were not a nuisance. They were geopolitical forces. At the same time, in the Bay of Bengal, the Bengali Arakanese pirate lords known as the Mughal pirates forged an unholy alliance with local sultans, using fleets of small, agile ships to strike Mughal territories. They raided towns, freed captives, enslaved others, built a maritime kingdom that lasted decades. Mughal emperors, despite their vast armies, struggled endlessly against these sea kings who ruled rivers and coasts with unmatched mobility. The empires learned a painful truth: land armies cannot defeat water empires. As these battles raged across continents, a new generation of Western pirates emerged. The most violent, the most relentless. They were not strategists like Morgan, not visionaries like Misson, not empire builders like Barbarossa. They were storms in human form. Among them was Edward Teach, known to the world as Blackbeard, a man who understood the theatrical power of fear better than any ruler alive. Teach did not want a throne. He wanted chaos. He braided slow-burning fuses into his beard, set them alight in battle, and stepped onto decks like a demon rising from the underworld. Governors wrote to London that Blackbeard alone had paralyzed trade from Virginia to the Bahamas. He blockaded entire ports, captured ships with minimal bloodshed, and turned surrender into ritual humiliation. But beneath the monstrous image, Teach was calculating. He built alliances with corrupt colonial officials, striking deals for protection in exchange for bribes. He proved that fear and diplomacy could coexist in the same skull. Yet even Blackbeard, even Roberts, even Morgan, none ruled as absolutely as the one sovereign pirate queen who remained unchallenged, Ching Shih. While the world's pirates fought navies and negotiated with kings, she commanded a floating empire larger than most countries. Her red flag fleet dominated everything from Vietnam to Canton. Merchants obeyed her rules. Villages paid her taxes. Entire provinces trembled at the sight of her sails. Her navy was a nation, and she was its unquestioned ruler. But the world was tightening. Empires were growing desperate. Trade losses threatened national economies. Colonial ports pleaded for help. And soon, a global counterattack would erupt, coordinated not by one king but by many, united against one shared enemy. The pirate world. A final confrontation was approaching, more brutal and wide-reaching than any before. The fate of pirate empires hung in the balance, and the ocean prepared for the bloodiest years in its history. The oceans had grown darker than ever. Empires, once proud, towering structures of authority, had begun to feel small before the force of men and women who refused to kneel. Every nation that relied on sea trade, Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, the Dutch, the Mughals, the King, felt the same cold pressure tightening around their throats. It was not one pirate, not one fleet, not one island. It was the idea of piracy itself, spreading like a storm no king could control. But storms always reach a moment when wind and water collide so violently that nature itself decides who survives. The early 18th century became that breaking point. The moment when pirate empires and land empires collided in a global war of survival. At first, monarchs believed they could crush the threat by executing individual captains. They hung pirates in rows along harbors, smeared their bodies with tar, and left them as warning monuments. The corpses swung from gallows like macabre decorations. But to the public, they did the opposite. People whispered their names, romanticized them. In taverns, sailors toasted dead pirates as martyrs. The more kings tried to kill their legends, the stronger those legends became. Governors felt the shift. Admirals felt the humiliation. Merchants felt the panic. And so began the most aggressive naval mobilization of the early modern world. Across oceans, thousands of soldiers were dispatched, entire fleets reassigned, and secret treaties forged, all for one purpose. Not to protect empires, but to annihilate pirate rule forever. But pirates were not merely targets. They were shapeshifters. They adapted faster than any government expected. In the Caribbean, as British warships arrived with orders to exterminate every rogue vessel, pirates began forming councils, vast alliances between former rivals who understood the stakes. MTT, ships that once hunted each other now sailed side by side. Rum-filled arguments transformed into strategy sessions. Outlaws who never trusted anyone now trusted each other enough to gamble their lives on a shared cause. It was during this tension that the most efficient pirate strategist of the Golden Age rose to prominence, Bartholomew Roberts. Unlike Blackbeard, Roberts was disciplined, sober, and terrifyingly logical. He created one of the most strict pirate codes ever written and enforced it like a general running a navy. His men followed him not out of fear, but respect. He captured more ships than any other pirate in recorded history, a number so large that contemporary officials refused to print it. worried the public would realize that pirates were more effective at naval warfare than governments. Roberts created a compact fleet, sleek and fast, with captains who could anticipate British maneuvers with frightening precision. He became not just a pirate king, but an institutional threat. His success forced Britain to divert war resources from European conflicts just to counter him. Counter him. But Roberts was only one piece of the global chessboard. Far across the world, the Indian Ocean entered its own inferno. The Maratha naval commander Kanhoji Anger, labeled a pirate of the Konkantin by Europeans, executed maritime strategies that left Portuguese, Dutch, French and British companies enraged and helpless. Anger did not see himself as a pirate. He saw himself as a defender of native seas. And in practice, he was right. For over half a century, no European power could defeat him. Coastal forts, safe harbors, and natural geography turned his region into an impenetrable fortress. British East India Company officers wrote in classified reports that Anger was more dangerous than a French invasion, yet they could not defeat him with entire squadrons of warships. And just as Europe struggled in the Indian Ocean, another war brewed in the South China Sea, where Qing Shih's empire remained untouched, untamed, and unbroken. She had built a floating civilization that rivaled the armies of the king. Her fleets taxed merchants, enforced laws, punished crimes, and protected allies. European traders respected her more than local governments. She became a sovereign in everything but title. But empires, cornered and desperate, began working together in secret. Major naval powers, once rivals, quietly exchanged maps, reports, and manpower. The objective was not to defeat each other. It was to destroy the very concept of pirate autonomy. The oceans became surveillance zones. Neutral harbors became traps. Governors bribed informants. Captains switched loyalties. Misinformation spread like disease. Governments realized something else. Pirates could not be defeated by force alone. They had to be defeated by betrayal. In Jamaica, former pirates who once fought alongside Morgan became hired hunters. In the Indian Ocean, British agents manipulated local kings to turn against Anger. In the Arabian Sea, the Jawazmi tribes were ambushed under false peace negotiations. In the South China Sea, king officials offered clemency to pirates who would join them and hunt Qing Shih's fleet from within. The war against piracy had shifted from cannon fire to psychological warfare, and yet, even under global siege, some pirates refused to fold. One such figure emerged from the cold Atlantic. Howell Davis, a cunning pirate who transformed deception into an art form. He infiltrated fortresses disguised as a merchant, captured warships by pretending to surrender, and bribed governors while secretly preparing to rob their towns. He was unpredictable, elegant in his methods, and a reminder that piracy was not simple robbery but a sophisticated form of warfare. But even Davis's brilliance could not overcome the new world taking shape. The war was tightening. The oceans were shrinking. Every pirate sanctuary became a battlefield. Madagascar, once the heart of Libertalia, turned into a graveyard of burned ships. European powers ravaged its bays, deported pirate families, and executed leaders. The dream of a pirate nation was smeared into dust. In West Africa, the pirate king of Bangla disappeared after a massive Portuguese offensive that destroyed entire coastal settlements. His fate remained unknown. Some believed he escaped inland. Others believed he died at sea. His absence signaled the collapse of pirate dominance on the Atlantic's African shores. In the Caribbean, the alliance that Roberts built faced relentless pursuit. The British Navy, now flooded with reinforcements, began boxing them in with complex maneuvers, learned from studying pirate tactics for years. Slowly, painfully, pirate fleets splintered. The ocean that once belonged to outlaws became a prison. Roberts, refusing surrender, died in battle, his body thrown into the sea as he had ordered. His death marked one of the final nails in the coffin of the Caribbean's pirate age. But the greatest showdown, the most dramatic, the most political, the most transformative, occurred in the South China Sea. For the first time in history, an empire did not try to destroy a pirate ruler. It attempted to negotiate. Qing diplomats realized that Qing Shih's fleet was too large, too organized, too deeply rooted to defeat without risking a complete collapse of maritime stability. So they did something unimaginable. They offered her full amnesty. They offered her rank. They offered her wealth, land, and legitimacy. They offered her a way to end piracy on her terms. The Pirate Queen did what no pirate king before her had ever achieved. She dissolved her fleet without spilling a single drop of blood, retired peacefully, and lived the rest of her life in prosperity, untouched by law. She ended piracy by winning. Her survival marked the symbolic end of the great pirate empires. Where others were hunted, she bargained. Where others were killed, she retired honored. Where others died forgotten, she shaped the end of an era. By the early 19th century, the world had changed irreversibly. Naval technologies advanced. International treaties standardized maritime law. Powerful empires expanded coast guards, patrols, and surveillance. The oceans, once the wild frontiers of possibility, became regulated highways. And the age of pirates who ruled empires silently faded into history. But their legacies remained. They had proven that rule did not belong only to kings. That power could rise from the lowest depths. That forgotten people could shape nations. That the sea belonged to those who dared to take it. And long after empires faded, long after navies rusted, long after coastal fortresses crumbled, one truth survived in every port, every legend, every coastal whisper carried by the wind. The real rulers of the oceans were never the emperors. They were the pirates.